Well, that's not good.
What happened?
I had some notes. Let me see if I left them in the car.
I looked everywhere for my copy of Mere Christianity. It's somewhere in that rubble in my office. Couldn't find it. I found several other books by him, but I was reading it a few months ago. Yeah. It's
Well,
interesting.
guess what? That's all right.
You swing it?
Maybe I'll be able to. That's kind of irritating. I had them in my hand before I left.
Nothing upset.
Well, it's probably. Yeah, that's okay. Well, I do that sometimes. Probably was reading over it and then left it. So we'll just the only thing that I don't have would be the places where I need to flip to the next slide. So we'll just have to see if I can figure that out. All right, so we've made it, I think, to chapter 3. This is book 1, chapter 3, and just as a reminder, book 1, chapter 1. Lewis begins by pointing out that when people argue, they often appeal to a shared standard of behavior, what he calls the law of human nature or moral law. This law is different from natural laws like gravity because humans can choose to obey or disobey it. Everyone seems to agree that some behaviors are right and others are wrong, even if they don't always act accordingly. This common moral standard, Lewis argues, suggests that there is more to reality than just physical nature. It hints at a universal moral law. Then chapter 2, Lewis addresses common objections to the idea of a universal moral law. One objection being that morality is just a social convention. We talked about that. Or an instinct. Lewis disagrees, saying if it were just an instinct, we wouldn't need to choose between instincts. We'd just follow the strongest one. Instead, we often judge between conflicting interests, which implies a third standard, the moral law, guiding which instincts to follow. And then he also says that moral progress, like abolishing slavery, only makes sense if there is a real standard to measure against. Otherwise, there'd be no better, only different. So there's this idea that there are better ways to do things, so there's got to be a yardstick by which we measure. All right, so chapter 3 here. Again, Mere Christianity. There's nothing going right.
I feel you.
All right, so chapter 3, the reality of the law. All right, so humans have an idea of behavior they ought to practice: fair play, decency, morality, law of nature. Humans consistently fail to live up to this standard, though. All right, so let's read from the text here. I now go back to what I said at the end of the first chapter, that there were two odd things about the human race. First, they're haunted by the idea of a sort of behavior they ought to practice, what you might call fair play, or decency, or morality, or the law of nature. Second, that they did not, in fact, do so. That's the irony, right? We understand that there is this law of nature, but then we don't actually practice, the proper behavior. Now, some of you may wonder why I call this odd. It may seem to you the most natural thing in the world. In particular, you may have thought I was rather hard on the human race. After all, you may say, what I call breaking the law of right and wrong, or of nature, only means that people are not perfect. And why on earth would I expect them to be perfect? Well, that would be a good answer if what I was trying to do was to fix the exact amount of blame which is due to us for not behaving as we expect others to behave. But that's not my job at all. I'm not concerned at present with blame. I'm trying to find out truth. And from that point of view, the very idea of something being imperfect, of its not being what it ought to be, has certain consequences. If you take a thing like a stone or a tree, it is what it is, and there seems no sense in saying it ought to have been otherwise. Of course, you may say that a stone is the wrong shape if you want to use it for a rockery, or that tree is a bad tree because it does not give you as much shade as you expected. But all you mean is that the stone or the tree does not happen to be convenient for some purpose of your own. You're not, except as a joke, blaming them for that. You really know that given the weather and the soil, the tree could not have been any different. What we, from our point of view, call a bad tree is obeying the law of nature just as much as a good one is, right? So they can't control that. That is beyond their control. They're just following nature. You've seen trees sometimes that are crooked because they're shaded, and so they seek the sunlight. Well, that's just what they're going to do because that's a law of nature, right? And they can't choose to not follow their nature. So, now have you noticed what follows?
Should Jesus have condemned the fig tree?
Let me take a quick, well, you know what? You know what? Okay, so I'll leave that up for a moment. But let me. I got to figure out where the break is here. Now, have you noticed what follows? So we're talking about the law of nature as a good tree and a bad tree both follow the laws of nature. Whether we consider it good or bad, it's following the same law. Now, if you notice what follows, it follows that what we usually call the laws of nature, the way weather works on a tree, for example, may not really be laws in the strict sense, but only in a manner of speaking. When you say that falling stones always obey the law of gravitation, is not this much the same as saying that the law only means what stones always do? So you see the distinction there. When you say that falling stones always obey the law of gravitation, isn't this the same or much the same as saying that the law only means what stones always do? So we're observing what stones do, and so that defines the law, as opposed to the law defining what stones do. I mean, the two go hand in hand, right? You don't really think that when a stone is let go, it suddenly remembers that it's under orders to fall to the ground. You only mean that, in fact, it does fall. In other words, you cannot be sure that there is anything over and above the facts themselves, any law about what ought to happen as distinct from what does happen. So we can only see what happens, so we don't know that we can't discern that there is some overriding law above that, because that thing never happens. When you drop a stone, it never not falls to the ground, okay? So if there is a separate law which governs the motion of rocks, it never apparently comes into effect. So we can't discern that there is anything other than that law. The laws of nature, as applied to stones or trees, may only mean what nature in fact does. But if you turn to the law of human nature, the law of decent behavior, it is a different matter. That law certainly does not mean what human beings in fact do. For as I said before, many of them do not obey this law at all, and none of them obey it completely. The law of gravity tells you what stones do if you drop them, but the law of human nature tells you what human beings ought to do and do not. You see what I'm saying? This is the opposite. When you drop a rock, it's going to fall. That's the law of nature. The law of human nature says that human beings ought to be good and nice and fair, but they are not. So they do the very opposite thing in many cases. In other words, when you are dealing with humans, something else comes in above and beyond the actual facts. You have the facts, how men do behave, and you also have something else, how they ought to behave. In the rest of the universe, there need not be anything but the facts. Electrons and molecules behave in a certain way, and certain results follow, and that may be the whole story. But men behave in a certain way, and that is not the whole story, for all the time you know that they ought to behave differently. Does that make sense? I mean, we see how, the planets go in their orbits, and the rocks fall and the trees grow, and it's all very predictable. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to predict the weather. And I don't care. We can joke about it, but they can predict the weather. I mean, it's a pretty exact science these days. Maybe not in times past, but certainly now we have pretty good models. So human beings, however, you can't say that we always follow a predictable pattern. We do things different ways, even when we ought to, according to the group expectations, a different. If the group expects for us to act one way, we can act the other. We have certain standards, but we very often fall short of those standards. So what might be another word? I'm just going to stop for a moment. What might you call that ability of a human being not to behave in a certain way? The ought to, the free will, right? So isn't that interesting? It's kind of like free speech, right? I mean, nobody argues with speech that everybody likes, right? The only way you can define free speech is with speech that people don't like, speech that's offensive. So, how do we define free will? We define free will as being able to do things that God doesn't want us to do, right? I mean, wouldn't that be a fair assessment? If we could only do the things that God or that natural law allowed for us to do, then we would not have free will. So again, it's kind of ironic because we think of free will as much as free speech as a good thing. We like for that. That's a positive thing. But we kind of have to define it in terms that are unappealing, perhaps, or have a negative connotation. Okay. So maybe this is the break point. Let's go ahead and talk about our scripture reference. Again, this is picked out by the AI as being, because, C.S. Lewis didn't give scriptural references, generally speaking, in this, but I wanted to inject some into our discussion. So here is the scripture reference for this particular section, Romans 7:21-23. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God in my inner being, but I see in my members another law, waging war against the law of my mind and making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. So, what do we think about that reference? I delight in the law of God in my inner being, but I see in my members another law waging war against the law of my mind. So that is this idea that, we want to be good, but we are conflicted, right? And that can drive us to do the opposite of what we, ought to do. That oughtness tells us that we should do.
I would see that passage is helpful to understand the principle that our author's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
It's analogous. You could say it's like an analogy because Paul is actually talking about a law that was revealed, special revelation, through the prophets. And that's the codified law. Either the law of Moses and or the law of Christ. Any of those things that are against sin.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Lewis is making a little bit broader, and he's not confining it, as I understood him, to the written law of God yet, but rather it's a principle that everybody, even pagans who've never heard of Christianity or Judaism, seem to have. It's a principle they seem to be aware of.
Mm-hmm.
Know they ought to live. Of course, none of us does, even in the best of countries. But so it's an analogy, I would say. In other words, to make his point, we know there's a moral law. We ought to live a certain way, but we don't, and that has to be explained. Why is it we don't live that way?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what Paul's saying there about this revealed law of God.
Mm-hmm. And so another thing that might be worth considering is how much of this is pre-programmed and how much of this is learned. So do we just naturally understand that there is a right and a wrong? Is that something that we have to discern from engaging with other human beings?
I thought of that earlier. I was thinking of ways that this classic old argument could be critiqued, especially in modern Britain or the West today. And one of them would probably be, and he deals with it there. I mean, through the book, he does deal with the fact. They would say, oh, well, after all, it's still learned behavior, still just a custom. Mm-hmm. You would think this because you grew up in England, which in the past had a history of Christian belief. Mm-hmm. So that's why you think that most people, that everybody you associate with, would believe that there is a law that we ought to comply with, a higher law. Mm-hmm. But it's not necessarily the case in other places, they would argue. But to get to your other point, I've been asking that question for years, and I don't have a clear answer. I'm a little bit reluctant to say that the law is innate in our minds because of another set of convictions I developed early in life, which are very anti-rationalistic, not rational in the sense of the lowercase r, but rationalism with the uppercase, which is a form of epistemology or study of knowledge, mm-hmm. the opposite of empiricism. I take what can be called a combinational approach, rational empiricism. The idea is something that Kant had developed. The idea is that the human being seems to be born with innate categories, but there's no content in the mind, no content in those categories. The rationalist says, no, you're born with latent ideas, like mm-hmm. Plato said. And as you grow up, you start remembering things you already knew when you were born. Mm-hmm. The empiricist would argue, you can't know anything apart from the sensations, the five senses from the physical world. So we can't be sure that our minds are processing what's really out there because we don't know if our minds are conformed to the reality. Well, the rational empiricist says we have the categories and we can do that. But when you go back to the idea of where does the moral law reside in each human person? Is it in, well, rationalism would say you're born knowing it, the Platonic view, you might say. And Calvinists and Augustinians are very, very in favor of that idea. It's usually associated with them. Whereas I would say it's probably more learned. Yet I do believe since we're made in God's image, we have a capacity that no lower animal can have. Mm-hmm. I didn't mean to go that far.
No. So you're you lean more towards the tabula rasa sort of a view of the human being. When they're born, you're just basically a blank slate, and everything that you are comes from your upbringing, the nurturing versus the natural inclinations. I mean, there's of course that would make perfect sense, you know. Of course, there are people that would say now that, well, yeah, but you know, we have these genetic memories, you know, that are there, that are passed down. Kind of the there's a video game series called Assassin's Creed. Have you ever heard of that? It's pretty anti-Christian, honestly. It's a fun game though. You get to run around and stab people and, you know, murder them in the darkness. It's basically the Muslims are the good guys in this game, and all the Catholic popes, they're all evil. You know, they've got their all these what is it, those secret groups, the Illuminati type groups, you know, the Templars. Yeah, that's it. Anyway, It's interesting, but yeah, it's pretty rank when it comes to philosophy. Uh, but yeah, that's the whole premise is that, there are these genetic memories, and you could go back and you could relive past experiences through technological. Well, yeah, if I come from a line of, my great 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 grandfather was a certain historical personage, then I would, in my genetic code, have the memories of that person's life, and I could, through technology, go back and relive them.
Video game, but I don't think anybody could substantiate such a claim as that.
No, but that was always science fiction.
Yeah, but I don't know that the DNA molecule or any of the associated chemistry can carry information, and that it can carry information for the construction of the phenotype, but it can't carry information for the.
It can't. So I would agree with you that, obviously, I'm not going to.
Neurons involved that are already completed where you can have synapses anyway.
Yeah, well, okay. So, your life is just so much data is involved with everything you've ever done in your life. There's no way to transmit that genetically, no matter how complicated. That's many phone books worth of data, even compressed. But they have done some interesting experiments, where they teach rats to go through a maze, and then their offspring can go through it quicker. They can, detect that the offspring have some sort of genetic memory. Now, again, it's not to the level of, I remember what my grandfather had for lunch, when he was 15 or something. But I don't know. The evidence seems to indicate that there's something there. But again, does that inform? Are we talking about good versus evil, right versus wrong? Stuff like that. I would tend to go that way myself. We all are responsible for our own selves, and we don't. The very fact that the Bible tells us that we don't bear, the iniquities of our fathers, at least from the standpoint of being responsible for them, means that we can't carry that guilt on from them to us. We can't inherit that guilt. So again, we are born with a blank slate, spiritually speaking. So why would we carry any baggage from their life to ours? That kind of borders on the, past life kind of a philosophy, where I had a life before this one. I was reborn, I was reincarnated, and I have this baggage from some past life that could impinge upon my current lifetime. So yeah, I think for those reasons alone, it's a good. I think you're on strong footing there.
To this point, I've settled on this. At least at minimum, we can say the human race, since we all did descend from the sons of Noah.
Mm-hmm.
All peoples came through that funnel after the creation. That we have a collective tradition or a sense that's been passed on in every culture. It's fainter, it's a lot dimmer in some, and other cultures are not as far removed. They haven't been as corrupted, but others have gone way out. They've gone far and they've gone fast. But there's still that vague memory of right and wrong that was bequeathed by Noah, I would think. So at least we know that's probably one factor about the moral law. But again, it seems not to do justice to the argument he's making. Seems to depend on the idea there has to be some innate ability, not necessarily content, but an innate category of the mind that has the capacity to feel and to understand moral obligation.
Mm-hmm.
Could that be the soul we're talking about? Does that figure in somehow to that? The ability to recognize morality?
Well,
Animals don't.
well. Let me point this out. So let's talk about Romans 2:14 through 15. For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they're a law unto themselves, Even though they do not have the law, they show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. So, is this evidence of a moral compass, so to speak? Is this the vestiges of, and again, is this imparted through the teaching of and the social norms of the society that you're born into? To your point, we're all come through Noah. I mean, clearly, we all, to some degree or another, regardless of whether we've been, properly churched, should have that imparted to us through our parents, through the society around us, right? Is that what it is, or is there something more to it? Is there some intangible, extra, worldly part of us, the soul, as you say?
I don't know. I didn't mean it that way. I just meant that gives us the capacity to have these laws and moral ethics have been passed down to us through Noah or whomever.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's mystical per se, that I didn't mean it that way exactly.
Well, yeah, and I don't mean to. I'm just kind of throwing that out there too. That there is that reference that perhaps we could bring to bear.
Well, and that reference, it would depend, first of all, on your starting principles. If you're a rationalist, you might think, well, the law of God is written on their hearts. That must mean they're born innately knowing. Well,
But how to get written on their heart?
You could say the heart is a metaphor, anyways. I mentioned the other day.
Sure.
The heart is a metaphor for what we would call the mind today,
Mm-hmm.
or set of facts we have knowledge. So to say that is just to say they carry in their mind ideas about right and wrong.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. The explanation we're looking for is what's the origin of the ideas in their mind today? Was it historic memory?
Who wrote it?
Yeah, where did it come historically from God, or was it written directly, as Red was talking about, like on the soul?
Mm-hmm.
No, I didn't. That's not what I was trying to say. I don't think that. I don't think it was. That was not what I was saying at all.
No, I said you were talking about it.
Oh, okay. No.
I didn't say you affirmed it.
Okay.
Well, I mean, do you have thoughts on that? On your comment?
No, I just meant that it's not really to the point exactly, but it just seems to have some bearing on it. Animals don't have this, no matter what society they grow up in, right? Or
Sure.
raised in. But we have the ability only through the fact that we have a soul, and somehow that plays into it. But I don't believe that anything of a moral nature is inherited by being a human per se, other than we have the capacity for learning it and realizing it once we've seen it,
Mhm.
had it taught to us.
So, if you were dumped on a desert island, before you had any contact with humans, but is it even worth going through that exercise? Because you end up with Tarzan, right? I mean, that type of thing, or you end up with, Lord of the Flies. I mean, there's people have different takes on that, But has there ever actually been a conclusive study done? I mean, it would be immoral to conduct such an experiment, right?
How do you know?
It would have to be, well, because I'm a Christian. That's how I know. But yeah, if you're a human being and you have a soul, what informs you? What is it about you that recognizes the moral law?
Well, if you're on a desert island, you're by yourself, morality is irrelevant, basically. Morality has to do with horizontal relationships. It's
Yeah.
a social matter.
Yeah.
I mean,
Do you mean that in
You
a?
could be impious or irreligious
Yeah.
and not worry about a higher power. That could be a fault, but you wouldn't be stealing and robbing others who are not there.
Yeah. So, we don't know for sure. But we do know that we should be able to recognize that there is a natural law because we have free will, right? I mean, I think that's what his argument is. We have free will, and we know that there are two ways to handle a certain situation. It's the man that's drowning. There's do you run and you save the man, or do you not save the man? So the question is, how do we know that one thing is right to do and the other is wrong? Okay, so that would be the distinction between, some sort of an external yardstick that we could measure that one choice is better than the other. more moral than the other, and that we can choose to not go and save that person and then just deal with the consequence. Now, some people rationalize and they don't mind letting somebody drown because, hey, whew, glad it wasn't me, and they'll find some excuse to justify it. But do they not really know that there is a good and a bad thing to do? But again, is that programmed or is that nature or nurture? All right, so we may not can answer that question directly.
I don't know.
Interesting to talk about.
I don't know if we have to for the sake of the argument. Do you? I mean, we just observe human behavior, and the moral law is a part. However, it originated in our conscience.
I think that for our purposes, when you talk to somebody, if you talk to somebody and they do not understand, they do not recognize that it is wrong to let someone drown that you could save, even if it puts you in some sort of peril, that I don't know, they might be a lost cause anyway. If you are not able to see that, then there might be something just wrong with you mentally that you just can't grasp. And that, not saying we shouldn't try to educate somebody like that, but there are just cold-blooded killers that are on death row because they just like to see people suffer and die. And, sometimes you just, you have to wash your hands or shake the dust off your sandals and move on. We got to save who we can. It's like, what was it? Old 999, the Papa's Pizza man that ran for president. Yeah, Herman Cain used to say, we got to save the savable. I think that's not a bad motto. You can spend your whole life trying to convert one incorrigible person, and you might, allow, 1,000 other people just to go off into eternity unprepared because you were distracted by that one person. Kind of the trolley dilemma, right? Save the savable, though. Not the worst idea in the world. So let's talk about the unique nature of moral law. I think we're at that point. I think that was the break point. Physical laws describe what objects do, i.e. gravity and stones, or for example, gravity and stones. Moral law describes what humans ought to do, but often don't. And maybe that was part of what we just talked about. I'm sorry, I don't have my... Oh, that's the same thing, isn't it? Did I go back?
No, Chris mentioned it. You just anticipated it when you mentioned it, but it wasn't.
Yeah, maybe I did. Sorry. Okay, well, let's read on and see if I've gotten back in sync here. All right, so when men behave in a certain way, and that is not the whole story, for all the time you know that they ought to behave differently. Now, this is really so peculiar that one is tempted to try and explain it away. For instance, we might try to make out that when you say a man ought not do as he does, you only mean the same as when you say that a stone is the wrong shape, namely that what he is doing happens to be inconvenient to you. But that is simply untrue. A man occupying the corner seat in the train because he got there first, and a man who slipped into it while my back was turned and removed my bag are both equally inconvenient, right? But I blame the second man and I don't blame the first. I'm not angry except perhaps for a moment before I come to my senses with the man who trips me by accident. I am angry with a man who tries to trip me up even if he doesn't succeed, right? So somebody might trip you accidentally and you can't be mad about that. If you do fall and, fall on your face, but somebody that tries to and you don't, that's the one you're mad at because they tried to do it. There was a purpose behind it. Yes, sir.
I don't know if this anecdote is relevant, but you remind me of an example. Recently in a sister congregation area, there was a visitor who came in, not a member, and she sat down in this pew just thinking it was an innocent place to sit. Well, it happened to be the place where some people habitually sat, and when they came and saw her there, they took great offense. In fact, they were so outraged, they said, "We're leaving." They got into an stormed out, and some people I know followed them out to try to de-escalate it. It didn't work. They went home.
Oh my goodness.
That was an inconvenient thing, and they were really upset about it.
Yeah, that's just the wrong attitude to have. And that sounds like a good basis for a sermon. So it is kind of funny, and it is ironic, somebody does something bad, but they do it accidentally. But how can you be mad? Because they did not know. But somebody that knows and they try but don't succeed, that's the one you should be mad with. Anyway, it's just ironic. So you're angry with the man who tries to trip me up, even if he doesn't succeed. Yet the first has hurt me, and the second has not. Sometimes behavior, which I call bad, is not inconvenient to me at all, but the very opposite. In war, each side may find a traitor on the other side very useful. But though they use him and pay him, they regard him as human vermin. So you cannot say that what we call decent behavior in others is simply the behavior that happens to be useful to us. And as for decent behavior in ourselves, I suppose it is pretty obvious that it does not mean the behavior that pays. It means things like being content with 30 shillings when you might have gotten 3 pounds, doing schoolwork honestly when it would be easy to cheat, leaving a girl alone when you would like to kiss her, we'll say, he was a little more, staying in dangerous places when you would rather go somewhere safer, keeping promises you would rather not keep, and telling the truth even when it makes you look a fool. So, again, there is convenient things to us that are not right. I do like that example he gives of the traitor, Of course, we're all like, hey, we like to see you, but we don't trust you because you're a traitor, You're kind of in one of those no-win situations when you do that. But the irony is, if he hadn't been a traitor, you'd have hated him worse, and you would have probably tried to kill him because you're in war, right? We need to kill that guy, but when he rats out the enemy.
I think even enemy soldiers, though, if they see their enemy stand firm when he's captured and under torture refuse to give secrets of his army, they still admire him. They'll kill him, but they still admire him.
Oh, sure. You do. And, and you think about the utility of that as a Christian, and that came into play, when Christianity was getting off the ground, right? Because they were put to death, and they did go to their death with honor and dignity, and they didn't, blaspheme. They didn't reject the name of Christ conveniently to get out of it. So that carried a lot of weight. So so that was the right thing to do. That is the honorable thing to do. That is the thing that it would be easy not to do, and yet we ought to do it.
It also has a positive effect on the cause, usually, like Philip was talking about letting our light shine.
Mm-hmm.
That's the ultimate way to do it. And I don't know, I may be wrong about this, but typically when there is persecution of that nature, didn't the church typically grow?
Yeah, you can't see that. Well, think about us. You think about that is one of the most important parts of the groundwork of apologetics. We say, hey, look at the disciples. They were there. They all saw what happened, and they went to their deaths, never refuting anything that they saw. They could have said, you know what, it was a big scam. Jesus, we snuck away with the body. They never said that. And again, we use this example or we use that as evidence because if they knew it was a scam, if they knew that Jesus hadn't, risen from the dead, what did it benefit them? They weren't going to get money or fame out of it dead. What good does it do them? So the very fact that they all, went to their deaths, crucified, all the various ways of dying without ever recanting tells me that it was legit. I mean, it actually happened, because certainly, and if it hadn't happened, that's why Christianity would have just died on the vine, so to speak, because it wasn't real. How many so-called messiahs appeared during that time? There were other people that claimed that they were the Messiah. Do you even know their names? I mean, Philip might. I mean, maybe Loretta might. Y'all might have studied that. It's kind of irrelevant other than just, pointing it out just as an example, as a contrast. But those people died and they weren't the Messiah, right? They went off into obscurity. The one who was the Messiah is the one we all know, because he was. And people knew it then, and we ought to know it now. So, all right, so I don't know. I don't know if I need to go to the next slide. Or let me see what the next slide says. Yeah, it's not merely about convenience or inconvenience. That's what we're talking about, right? We blame someone who intentionally tries to trip us. Yeah, we went through that. So that was the reading. So what's the scripture reference? Matthew 5:44-45. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. So again, that goes to the
enemies are very inconvenient for you.
Yes. The enemies are inconvenient for you. And there is this, you would really rather that they fail and they have hard times, right? Isn't that the natural inclination? We really would like for them to lose their next election because they are doing bad things and we don't agree with them. And, we could do things about that. That's not bad, but we shouldn't, when he says pray for those who persecute you, he's not saying pray for their death. He's not saying pray for them to come to a bad end. You're praying for them to change their ways. You're praying for them to come to an understanding of the truth. That's what we used to pray. We used to pray, please, Biden, let him see the light and completely do a 180. And, that's the kind of stuff you pray, right? Not for bad things to happen. And so it's difficult to do, though, because and it's difficult to really absorb that and make that part of you. Because again, it's just this human nature. We feel like that when, it should be an eye for an eye, right? It should be when somebody slaps me, I slap them back. But that's not Christianity. That is, it rises above that, that innate kind of human nature. All right, so some argue moral behavior exists because it benefits society as a whole. So this is the common alternative explanation, social utility. All right, so let me read this next section here. Some people say that though decent conduct does not mean what pays each particular person at a particular moment, still it means what pays the human race as a whole, and that consequently there is no mystery about it. Human beings, after all, have some sense. They see that you cannot have any real safety or happiness except in a society where everyone plays fair, and it's because they see this that they try to behave decently. Now, of course, it is perfectly true that safety and happiness can only come from individuals, classes, and nations being honest and fair and kind to each other. It is one of the most important truths in the world, but as an explanation of why we feel as we do about right and wrong, it just misses the point. If we ask, why ought I to be unselfish? And you reply, because it is good for society. We may then ask, why should I care what's good for society except when it happens to pay me personally. And then you'll have to say, because you ought to be unselfish, which simply brings us back to where we started. You're saying what is true, but you are not getting any further. If a man asked, what was the point of playing football, that's soccer to you and me, it would not be much good saying, in order to score goals. For trying to score goals is the game itself, not the reason for the game. And you would really only be saying that football was football, which is true, but not worth saying. In the same way, if a man asks, what is the point of behaving decently, it's no good replying, in order to benefit society. For trying to benefit society, in other words, being unselfish, for society, after all, means other people, is one of the things decent behavior consists in. All you're really saying is that decent behavior is decent behavior. You would have said just as much if you had stopped at the statement, men ought to be unselfish. And that's where I do stop. Men ought to be unselfish, ought to be fair, not that men are unselfish, not that they like being unselfish, but that they ought to be. The moral law, or law of human nature, is not simply a fact about human behavior in the way that the law of gravitation is, or may be simply a fact about how heavy objects behave. On the other hand, it's not a mere fancy, for we cannot get rid of the idea, and most of the things we say and think about men would be reduced to nonsense if we did. And it's not simply a statement about how we should like men to behave for our own convenience, for the behavior we call bad or unfair is not exactly the same as the behavior we find inconvenient, and may even be the opposite. Consequently, this rule of right and wrong, law of human nature, or whatever you call it, must somehow or other be a real thing, a thing that is really there and not made up by ourselves. And yet it is not a fact in the ordinary sense, in the same way as our actual behavior is a fact. It begins to look as if we shall have to admit that there is more than one kind of reality, that in this particular case, there is something above and beyond the ordinary facts of men's behavior, and yet quite definitely real, a real law which none of us made, but which we find pressing on us. All right, so that's the end of this chapter, but let's see what our scripture reference here. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Well, there you go. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? So this argument about, moral behavior existing because it benefits society as a whole, again, the circular reasoning. Why be unselfish? For society's good. Why care about society? Because you ought to be unselfish. It's just, there's, where is the yardstick? Where is the thing that you're measuring against? Again, these are, you could go back and you could say, well, why shouldn't we kill the Jews? You can make these kind of arguments because it helps us if we kill the Jews. Society's better if we kill the Jews, which of course is.
You're not talking about Hitlerism. You're talking about present-day campus.
Well, yeah, I'm not talking about modern Democrats. I'm talking about Hitler. Although, it's a distinction without a difference, or a difference without whatever. Okay, so then I think this was the last section. That was the last section. The moral law is not simply a description of human behavior like gravity, is not merely a human invention or preference. It appears to be something real that exists independently of us. It suggests that there might be more than one kind of reality, and it points to a real law that we didn't make, but we find pressing on us. I guess you would call that the conscience. Your conscience is bothering you. Well, why would your conscience bother you? Because you know that you ought to do this, and yet sometimes you don't do this. But, we get back into that question of where did that come from? How do we know about it? So here's a scripture reference that was chosen, Psalms 19, 7 through 9. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The rules of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. So I guess this goes to the fact that there is this law outside of ourselves, outside of society and what we would deem as being the right thing to do. So again, telegraphing the ultimate point that there is an ultimate right and wrong, an ultimate moral law.
Of course, we Christians have access to the answers that are given in the back of the book. We already know what that moral law is, and its source ultimately is in God, our Creator. But the beauty of this argument that Lewis was setting forth, he's not the only one to do it, but it's probably the best statement I've ever heard of, because it's just so down to earth for everybody to grasp, is that he doesn't presuppose already you have any concept of God. You may be an atheist, complete atheist, raised as a pure secularist, but he's saying that even you and your family recognize this law that's pressing. Where did it come? How do you explain that law? It's not so much as a psychological question. It's I would say, an analytical question. How can there be or exist such a law by definition if there is not some sort of lawgiver or some other kind of reality in which the law ultimately resides?
Exactly. And I think he might touch on this in the summary, the implications for understanding God. The moral law suggests a lawgiver beyond ourselves. It points to a reality above material existence. James 4:12 says, there is only one lawgiver and judge, he who is able to save and destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? So again, there is an ultimate authority here, and it is beyond ourselves. It's beyond human beings. And of course, there's plenty of arguments that we can make. I went back to the old, example of us. If somebody hits you, you want to hit them back. That's just human nature. And there is a fairness in that, in a sense, the eye for an eye model. But Christianity transcends that. And why would that come from human beings? Why would a human being devise a system by which someone hurts you and you don't hurt them back? You don't extract some sort of a payment from them in restitution. I mean, we even do that in civil law, right? I mean, somebody hurts us, we get money back. We don't maybe put their eye out because they put ours out. But is that even? I mean, I think sometimes we might need to even think about that. Is that the right thing to do, to extract any kind of vengeance on someone who does us wrong? There's certain circumstances where somebody might do something to us, and we legally might have a recourse for some sort of restitution, but it might not necessarily always be the right thing to do morally, the right thing to do from a Christian standpoint. It might be better to just forgive and forget, and to extend grace to someone who has done something to you. That might be more. Might be more the Christian thing to do, because you might, again, with just thinking about the Bible, the biblical principles. Who was it that was chastised for taking their brothers to court? Yeah. So, don't you're gonna. Isn't that the precursor to the don't you know that we'll judge angels? And the idea that we ought to transcend the civil law. There is a law that transcends just the mundane. So again, where would a mere human being come up with these concepts? It's very difficult to fathom that a human being would come up with this system. It just seems divine. It seems like there's got to be the hallmarks of divinity there. All right, so let me